Oh, right, okay. Can you hear me? Right, I'm at DF5 at the moment. Right, let's kick off for round 3. Good afternoon, everybody. We're now well practiced at this, that's much better. And it is officially the afternoon. Just introduce myself again for those who weren't here in the first session. My name is Richard Smith, I'm the director of the Tank Museum, and therefore I'm a rather lucky chap because this is my day job, which it never quite wears off, it's great. Our next speaker will be familiar to many of you. Can I just ask a quick show of hands, who has watched our YouTube channel? Our next speaker is familiar to all of you. It needs very little introduction. Our next speaker is in practice the world's leading authority on early armour. When I applied for my job, my bog time reading was one of his books. It is a tremendous honour to have him working with us, and it is always inspiring and informative to hear him speak. He's going to be talking to us today about Straussler armoured cars. Please join me in welcoming our very own David Fletcher.
Well, thank you, Richard. I was told I could only talk for half an hour, so I've done the talk accordingly, I hope. I'm going to do it on Nicholas Straussler. You will probably be most aware of him as the inventor of the DD tank, the amphibious tank, which is as good as a thing to be known for as any. They sank, but we can't have it always. But I'm going to look at him as a designer of armoured cars. He was doing that from about 1930 onwards. So I thought I'd deal with them today because they're a subject few people know much about, and it gives me a chance to air my useless knowledge. But also, it gets us into an earlier period. It gets us away from modern fighting, right back to the days before the Second World War, when the whole idea of tanks was more or less in the air. Everyone was umming and ahhing about how they ought to be designed, and all coming up with different ideas. Straussler had some very good ideas, but as you'll see when I sort of go into these things, they weren't all that successful, and I think I know why. But for the moment, we'll just have a look at what he invented and take it from there. Now, I don't know whether you can see this. I'm sorry about the conditions in here, but the light is so great that we can't really bring these slides out as much as we'd like to. But this is the first vehicle that Straussler himself is said to have designed. It was done as part of a competition to come up with a commander's vehicle for the Royal Artillery. FWD was one, and Straussler was the other, and they came up with this idea. The Straussler vehicle is powered by a Model A Ford engine, 24 horsepower. It's got four-wheel drive and four-wheel steering, but the weird thing about it is the steering wheel. As you'll see, it's vertical. You can just about see that, but it's actually on a vertical post. And the idea was the whole thing, steering wheel, seat, and all the controls swiveled round, so it could drive the vehicle in both directions. It also has four-wheel steering, which is something I'm not very much in favour of. But when we investigated this thing, they said its four-wheel drive ability was incredible, one of the best they'd ever seen. But they didn't like the steering system at all, and who can blame them? I think the driver must have nearly gone nuts trying to work this out. But that's how it was done. You had a vertical steering wheel, and you turned it in whichever direction you felt was necessary to drive the vehicle. It would go in both directions. Had a 4-speed gearbox, but that was 4 speeds in each direction. Reverse was done as a separate system at the back. So you only really needed to know which way you were going, and that would be decided by the driver. But neither this vehicle nor the one by FWD ever developed far enough to have a body. In fact, I suspect that what Straussler was trying to do was develop a scout car, which isn't a bad idea, except that the scout car hadn't been considered at this time. This is about 1931, 32, and So there was no design existing for a body. That, as a chassis, was about as far as it got, with the Model A Ford engine in. But that vehicle was the only one that Straussler designed at the time. He was really working on armoured cars. And that's his first effort towards an armoured car, the AC-1. It was actually made by Manfred Weiss in Budapest. And although Straussler was a Hungarian by birth, he decided to come over. He'd come over to England as a young man before the First World War. And I have read that he acted as an advisor for the Royal Ordnance Factory. Now I find that very difficult to believe. All things considered, he was a Hungarian, which made him an enemy alien, and I can't imagine, although maybe they were easier on them then than they have been since, I don't think they would have allowed him in Royal Ordnance, so I don't know how he dealt with that. But at that time he was only designing amphibious things and bridging equipment for for Vickers Armstrong, in fact, and being quite successful. But he obviously had armoured cars on the brain. Now this vehicle is powered by a 100 horsepower engine. I think it was a Ford, I don't really know. But the odd thing about it is that the armoured car, at least when it left Hungary, it was just a hull. It didn't have a turret on it because the Hungarians, like the Germans, were not allowed to produce fighting vehicles. They had to produce just the running chassis. So they produced this thing, and you'll notice, if you can see it, it's got a tubular backbone for a chassis. Now that is quite original. It has a tubular backbone with swing arms down to each wheel. But the interesting thing is, the tubular backbone wasn't Straussler's own invention. It had already been invented by Otto Daimler, among others, and seemed to be a more effective system altogether for this kind of vehicle. But that's the AC-1. It has 4 speeds. It can go 4 speeds in each direction, but required the driver to look over his shoulder. Nothing ever came of it. The AC-1 was used as the first example of an armoured car by Straussler and seems to have just vanished really soon afterwards. Now the AC-2 was very similar. It was built again by Manfred Weiss in Budapest, driven to England with an armoured body on it, and the turret was actually fitted later. It never had a turret when it arrived in this country because the Hungarians weren't allowed to produce them. But it had a turret at this time armed with the Vickers 303 machine gun. And the vehicle itself is powered by a Ford engine, we know that, but now slightly greater horsepower than the one on the earlier vehicles. And it was taken over by the Royal Air Force. It was actually given to the Royal Air Force to test. They took it out to Cairo by ship, and then drove it from Cairo to Baghdad, which is quite a long way, mostly across open desert. They were escorted by Rolls-Royce armoured cars, which were in RAF service at the time. But that's a picture from this trek, and they're moving. For some reason they've got 3 or 4 suitcases there. I don't know why they took suitcases. The RAF would have put them up pretty comfortably, but that's how they travelled. And this vehicle seemed to be the bee's knees. The RAF armoured car companies were using Rolls-Royces, most of which they'd acquired from the army and had since built some themselves, but they were still a very old-fashioned 4x2 design. This was altogether more modern. It was a 4x4 with a lot more sort of use as a fighting vehicle than the 4x2. It was heavily tested in Baghdad. The RAF in particular regarded the armoured car, this one, as the sort of thing they really wanted. It was much more like an armoured car than any of those that had gone on previously, and they seemed to have been very happy with it. What they didn't tell you was that although it travelled well in both directions and had 4-wheel drive and 4-wheel steering, All these four-wheel steering vehicles have a nasty habit of getting up alongside a wall and then not being able to get away again. You put on a right-hand lock to get away from the wall, and the back swings into the wall instead. So that's something that Straussler kept up all the way through his career in designing these things, and that's one of them. But that vehicle is probably one of the most interesting. Not much ever came of it. In 1937, Straussler came to an agreement, I suppose, with Alvis in Coventry, and that led to the appearance of the Alvis-Straussler company, and they produced 27 armoured cars. 12 of them went to the Dutch East Indies, that's one of them. 12 of them went to the Royal Air Force, I'll come to them in a minute, and the other 3 went to Portugal, and it's the Portuguese, for some reason, who kept at least one. So there is a Straussler armoured car somewhere around the world, if you care to go and look for it. The difference between the Dutch armoured cars and the ones used by the RAF is in the shape of the hull. With the Dutch cars, the hull sweeps inwards over the wheels and is far more effective. It also has a hull-mounted machine gun. The RAF had a slab-sided vehicle with a turret-mounted machine gun, but not a hull-mounted one for some reason. I don't understand that at all. But they were powered by a 6-cylinder Alvis engine, rated at about 200 horsepower. So they had a bit of oomph with them in this case. But that's the Dutch version. And I think so is that. So you can see there the sides coming in, and you can just about see the hull-mounted machine gun. They have a turret-mounted machine gun as well, of course, but the slides aren't very good. The lighting here is a bit too bright for it. So we'll skip over that. You can't see that one any better. That's one of the RAF vehicles. They had 12 of these which were issued to number 2 Company Royal Air Force. 4 more were sent to Aden and became part of the Aden unit, and that was all. For some reason, First Armoured Car Company, which had Rolls Royces, kept them. I don't know why. Fords and these things, I should say, the Alvis-Straussers were only given to number 2 Armoured Car Company. And bearing in mind that they were invented in 1937, it seems rather odd. The whole lot were recalled to Britain on the outbreak of the Second World War, and they were used during the early years of the Second World War as airfield security vehicles, driving around the airfield. Now, one of the drawbacks was that although they had Alvis engines, and though they were built by Alvis, they'd actually relied on the Hungarians to supply a lot of the automotive bits and pieces for them. And they only did this because it was a lot cheaper to deal with Hungary. Of course, the difficulty was that when the war broke out, Hungary was rather foolishly on the other side, who I don't need to remind you lost. And therefore couldn't actually supply bits and pieces to these vehicles. So as they went out of service, that was the end of them. But they were, at the time, the Royal Air Force said they were the best armoured car they'd ever had. The only thing is, I feel, they had a rear driving position as well, so it would go in both directions. It still had this idea of 4-wheel steering. And one of the drawbacks with the 4-wheel steering was that in the hands of an inexperienced driver, they tended to turn over. And it's not really a good idea. One of them turned over actually and killed the people inside it. I think it was probably a write-off, because in the end about 11 vehicles were taken back to Britain instead of the 12 that had been sent out in the first place. But that's literally all I know about them. But they were quite good vehicles. The only trouble was they were tested at MEVI, which was the British group who tested new vehicles, and they managed to get a top speed of 35 miles an hour out of it, whereas Straussler claimed they had a top speed of 60 miles an hour. But they couldn't make it go at 60 miles an hour. The 35 was the best they got out of it. But that's another interesting vehicle in many ways, and it was the only vehicle the RAF had apart from these Rolls Royces, and yet the Rolls Royces survived. That's another picture of it. You've got a rear driver's position. You'd have a normal crew of 3 or 4 in here, a driver, 2 in the turret, another driver at the back who was required to drive it in reverse if you got into any trouble, but a 4-speed each-way gearbox to keep it going. And notice also a spare wheel, which is great if you're caught short, but in those days most people were using run flats to avoid that. But in the case of the RAF cars, they didn't. They used a spare wheel stuck on the back. It has radio fitted when it worked. There it is from the rear. But why it only had the turret-mounted machine gun, I've never understood. I would have thought the hull-mounted machine gun might be as useful. Though in fact, if you read the records of the RAF armoured car companies, they very rarely saw any action at all that involved firing a gun. Normally they worked on the principle if you turned up somewhere and there was a riot going on, the presence of an armoured car not firing more or less dispersed the rioters anyway, so they didn't worry about it. But that was the vehicle the RAF had. You can see a fairly large door on the left here, and that was how the crew got in and out. But once you're in, you're really more or less stuck. Now that really, in a sense, brings us to the end of the armoured cars that Straussler actually developed. But he built 2 more, or at least he designed 2 more before the Second World War broke out. The first one is based on the Alvis hefty lorry, which he built in quite large numbers. It had a tubular backbone and was pivoted in the middle, so that unlike the Pavesi, which would go every which way over rough country, the Straussler Hefty had a pivoting action, so it kept the 4 wheels in contact with the ground. Why they designed that shape of turret, I don't know. It's only a mock-up anyway, but it means that whoever got in it must be incredibly thin to serve the gun at all. But that was the one vehicle that Straussler at least built as a prototype. The other vehicle he built had twin engines. Now that's another thing that I would advise you, if you are designing a military vehicle, don't do. Don't fit them with twin engines. What invariably happens is that one engine or the other will fail. Not all the time, it may only be a hiccup, but if it fails when you're driving down the street, since one engine's driving the wheels on each side, the thing will slew round and maybe even go across the road into oncoming traffic. So the idea of using 2 engines isn't really that clever, but Straussler used it on some of his later armoured car designs and also on his early tank designs, which seems to me to be asking for trouble, but there we are. And that was another vehicle that he produced at this time. How are we doing? Are we doing better than I thought? This is the first armoured car he designed after the war. It only ever got as far as a chassis, but it was fitted with a type of rubber tyre, a pneumatic rubber tyre, which he called a ellipsoid tyre. It was a large format rubber tyre, but it was fitted with grips all the way round, so it had far better tractive effort than the sort of normal rubber tyres people use. But this 3-wheeler, there is a drawing of the armoured car design, but it never got to that stage. That was about the limit of this thing, but it was a very superior cross-country vehicle, apparently. Finally, really, Straussler came up with a design which you probably can't see. It was the design of a 6-wheel drive armoured car, which was meant to be a rival to the British Saladin, which was also a 6-wheel armoured car. The only difference was that Straussler had a driver at each end, and it steered on the front and back axles only. Again, it had this weird system of the both sets of axles being used to move it away from a wall and that kind of thing, and it didn't work. Because if you do that, you end up hitting the wall rather than driving away from it. But that was his design for an armoured car. Quite honestly, I would have thought it had, I think it's shown there with about a 4-man crew, and I would have thought with 2 of those men in the driver's seat, it probably isn't going to work anyway. But by then, I think Straussler suffers from what every inventor suffers from, and that was a sort of urge to invent. Whether it was any good or not didn't really matter. He kept on inventing things, and half the time none of them reached maturity. That one didn't either. But we'll just go on to show you one more thing, if you can see it. Now, it's quite odd that having made this link with Alvis, they broke it up before the war. So it lasted a year, 2 years at the most. Alvis then went on using Straussler technology to produce their own vehicle, and this is an example. So it's a Straussler type vehicle. It was actually designed in 1938, and it's one of the earliest scout cars of all. It was actually produced for a competition, which was run, I should say, by the VSA Daimler design, which became the Dingo, which we know. But that was the Alvis entry, had a tubular backbone built by Alvis. The engine was offset to one side to balance it out, and it had a 2-man crew. The original idea was to have loads of armour at the front and no armour anywhere else. But they decided very quickly that wasn't such a good idea, and surrounded it with armour, making it reasonably well protected. But that was one. The other vehicle, it's quite interesting, is that Manfred Weiss, the Hungarian, they developed an armoured car as well. I haven't got a picture of it to show you, but it was, doesn't matter anyway, you won't be able to see it. It was the Type 39, which was called the Zaba. And it was used by the Hungarian army and to some extent by the German army. It was actually quite an effective armoured car, but it was built very much to Straussler's design, with the same chassis and so on. And that's quite an odd thing that he seems to have lived on with other people's systems after his own demise. I was lucky, I met his widow and daughter a few years ago, but another of my friends, the late Bart van der Veen, actually knew Nicholas Straussler and is reckoned to be the authority on him. But, he's no longer here, so we can't ask him. But that was the vehicle he produced. It's very similar to the BSA design, but when they went into competition, the BSA design won and became the Daimler Dingo in the end. I don't know why or how, but that's what they did. But this and the Hungarian armoured car were based on Straussler technology. But really and truly, the only armoured car that Straussler built that was at least of some use was the RAF one. And I don't think that was that effective either. Any armoured vehicle that turns over at the drop of a hat is not a good idea, because going upside down doesn't work. So I think we'll leave it there with him, but in fact I think I've used up my time enough. But if anyone's got any questions, I'll try and deal with them. Thanks very much.
What kind of engine was in the armoured car?
An Alvis, I think a 4-cylinder engine. It made it quite a lively vehicle, but not good enough apparently.
Any more questions? David is going to be around afterwards for selfies and autographs. In the meantime, it's for those who are fans of the Tank Chats videos. what a great way to spend a Friday afternoon. Can you all join me together in thanking our very own David Fletcher for his talk? Our next speaker is going to be from our friends in Wargaming, talking about gaming and armour, and particularly what the work of Wargaming and what they've been doing to support us and a number of other museums. We're going to have about a 10-minute break or so before we kick off on that one. So once again, a chance to refuel and defuel as appropriate.